Good afternoon to those in the East. Good morning to those in the West. Good, whatever time of day it is for you, if you're neither in the East nor in the West. And welcome to the next in our Leaders of the Future series called Leading at the Next Level, Working in the Jewish World. We've spent the last few weeks giving you concrete skills if you want to volunteer or work at a nonprofit, but we have not until this time given you the tools that would actually help you get a job at a Jewish nonprofit, and think about the industry. And so we have two wonderful presenters with us today, Gali Cooks, President and CEO of Leading Edge, and Sarah Welch, Vice President of Workforce Development Services at the Network of Jewish Human Service Agencies, who are going to cover that. Next slide, please. A couple of logistical points before we get started. We have live captioning and an ASL interpreter for this webinar, and there will be instructions in the chat about how to enable the captioning if you do not, and you can spotlight the interpreter if you're having trouble seeing. We are not only taking questions, but we are happy to answer questions. One of our primary goals is to answer your questions. So please, if you have something to ask our panelists, use the Q&A box on Zoom, or if you're watching us via Facebook Live and you put a question in the comments, we will catch that too. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to Respectability's website along with the fully accessible PowerPoint by the end of this week. Next slide, please. I want to briefly thank our partners and co-promoters for this series. I will not read them all because that would take a great deal of time, but I do want to commend to all of you, if you take a look at this presentation afterwards, to check out all of the wonderful partners and collaborators that have helped to make this possible. Next slide, please. I do, however, want to take a moment to thank the generous funders that have made this series possible. The series specifically was funded through the generosity of the Jewish Community Foundation of Los Angeles and the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies. Without their support, we would not be able to deliver this content to you. I also want to take a moment to thank the David Berg Foundation, the Beverly Foundation, the Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation for their general support of our Jewish work, which is how we end up all being here for you today. Next slide, please. I want to remind you that there are two webinars left in this series. Next week, we will be teaching you about, July 15th is Thursday. Thursday, we will be teaching you about effective disability advocacy from the inside, understanding that many of you as budding leaders will not be in disability-specific roles, but may wish to push for inclusion. And so we will have folks to help you look at that question, and then a webinar that is really open for everyone, potential leaders, potential organizations, just updating the latest important information on accessible events. You can register for those and look at any webinars that you have missed at www.respectability.org/Jewish events. Without further ado, next slide, so I can say without further. Oh, that's right. There is one more. Never mind. Long day. So why are we doing this? By now, you've probably heard it because I've read this exact same slide each week, but including people with disabilities is something that more than 90% of Jewish organizations say they want to do. Yet a survey of the Jewish world shows that fewer than 15% of Jews can identify a single leader, meaning not a single leader at their organization, but a single leader anywhere with a disability in Jewish communal life. We sort of set out to solve that first by training organizations, which we did last year, and now by saying, okay, if we want a pipeline of leaders, we've got to actually train the leaders. So hopefully if you're here today, it is because you want or have an interest in potentially being one of those professional or lay leaders, and we're equipping you to do it. And again, if you go back and look at the previous webinars, that'll give you some great hard skills from understanding development to understanding how nonprofits run. So I really commend that to you. Next slide. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers, Sarah Welch and Golly Cooks. I believe that Golly is actually speaking first, so yes. Disregard the order on the slide, but Golly, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matan. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Respectability for inviting us to speak about really the state of play in the Jewish nonprofit sector, give you all a lay of the land, and share some of what we're learning as we get a sense of how Jewish organizations work. And as you all think about looking for jobs, what are some of the questions that you may have in your mind that are important to answer when you're looking at a position and sizing up the opportunity? So next slide, please. So I wanted to start really high level to give you a sense of where is the Jewish nonprofit sector located in the general nonprofit space, and can we put some numbers and just some scale around it? So some would be very surprised, I know I was, to learn that the nonprofit sector in general is really an economic engine. We are the third largest employer across the American economy, produce about 5.4% GDP, that's how much we contribute, and are made up of about 1.5 million organizations. And as I used to have a professor who said, the nonprofit sector, we don't just generate goods, we generate good. And that is something that you can see, especially in an era where some government funding is shrinking back, social needs are certainly growing. The nonprofit sector is really taking center stage in a variety of ways that makes it really exciting as you think of careers and you think of some of the ways in which you can build your own professional muscles. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in terms of the Jewish nonprofit sector? So there are 1.5 million nonprofits. They're about, we estimate, and there's literally an asterisk there to say an estimate, that there are about 9,500 Jewish organizations, so nearly 10,000. About a third of those are synagogues, congregations, so faith-based types of organizations. We also estimate that there are about 100,000 employees that make up the workforce of the Jewish nonprofit sector. So you saw in the previous slide, there are about 12 million or so nonprofits that employ, or 12 million employees that are employed across nonprofits, and we have about 100,000 of those. And part of what's happening in the Jewish nonprofit sector, just like general society, is some shifts in the leadership rhythms and the C-suite, which is, next slide, please, which is part of the reason why Leading Edge was created. There was an understanding that in order for us to do the important work of the nonprofit sector, in the Jewish nonprofit sector, we needed to invest in our leaders and our talent in order to carry that work forward. And there was an underinvestment in that. And so that's really the mission of Leading Edge, the organization that I lead. Next slide, please. And we do that work through support of senior leadership, supporting the lay professional partnership, so working with the board and the professionals and how those twin engines really lead our organizations, and then a focus on workplace culture. And that is really what I want to focus on today, and the biggest learnings for an employee who's thinking about, how do I want to spend the majority of my waking hours at work? Well, what are some of those things that we've been learning? So next slide, please. So for the last 5 years or so, since 2016, we have asked close to, really over, I should say, 35,000 unique employees across more than 325 organizations across our sector. So about 35% of the workforce, about their work experience. So trying to get a sense of what happens in the day-to-day and what enables people to maximize their potential or not. And that for us really is what is meant by a great place to work, a great workplace culture. Next slide, please. And so what I want to share, there's a full report of this. I'm not going to go into it. For anyone who's really interested, I'm happy to have an online conversation about this. But we do usually share back what we see about the sector to get a sense, are Jewish organizations great places to work? And the short answer to that is we're good, we're not great, and we're striving. And I want to share 5 tips as I think of you all seeking different employment opportunities. What are some critical things for you to be on the lookout as you assess where you want to spend your employment time? Next slide, please. So one of the other things, I think I have a few slides where I just want to give you a sense of like our ecosystem. The majority of Jewish nonprofits are small. And I would say that across the nonprofit sector in general, we have, I think the average budget of a nonprofit is about $100,000 a year. So we're talking tiny, and that's the general nonprofit sector. And I would say from a team size perspective, we're talking about organizations with 10 or fewer full-time employees. So just to get a sense of, what is the context in which you may be getting into as you look at Jewish organizations. Next slide, please. The other thing that is interesting to note is that the Jewish nonprofit sector is made up predominantly of women. So if you think of that 100,000 person workforce, it is about 70% or 2/3% women. And then when we look at the CEO or executive director role, the top professional leader, it is almost flipped in gender. So it's about 2/3 made up of men. And that's an interesting thing that as we've been looking at talent development and culture, an interesting thing to note. Next slide, please. The other aspect, I mean, Matan, you mentioned that, like a disproportionately, really low number of folks with disabilities are really employed or can be pointed to as leaders in our community. I will say that overall, we see that as well as it relates to race. So our workplaces are filled with predominantly white, Ashkenazi Jewish individuals, and yet about 1/3 of the employees are non-Jews. It's important to think about that. By the way, fun fact, they report back as being very satisfied, more than the average. Next slide, please. So one other thing before I go into the tips, in 2021, thanks to Respectability and the great work of Matan and Jennifer, we did ask 2 questions of nearly really over 11,600 employees who took our 2021 employee experience survey, wanting to get a sense around disability and how that is personified in our workforce. What we learned is approximately 8.5 of the employees answered that they have a disability, and you can see some of the language in there that we used. And of those, so of the about 950 who said, yes, I agree that I have a disability, about half agreed that their organization provides the necessary disability accommodations. So an interesting thing to note and something that we need to learn a lot more about. Next slide, please. So I would say overall what we're learning is that our organizations really have employees who are motivated by mission and feel proud of their work. So I'm going to show you some stats of just the ways in which our employees answered, like, yes, I feel, X, Y, and Z. So over here, as it relates to mission, which is really a critical factor of being engaged in your work, our employees have an overwhelming majority feel like they make a difference, and they understand how they make a difference day in and day out. And that's very important. You want to be able to see that progress. Next slide, please. So tip number 1, I would say, is work at an organization whose mission aligns with your values. Like there is, again, adults are spending the majority of their waking hours at work. If somehow that doesn't align with your values, that's gonna grate. So that's tip number 1. Next slide, please. The second thing that we found is your immediate manager is incredibly important. And what we learned there is something interesting, that managers seem to be incredibly well liked and feel those who are being managed feel like they're being respected and cared for. However, Managers aren't necessarily making employees better, making you stretch and get better every day. Next slide, please. And so in thinking about that, the reason why that's important is because we know that there's a recipe for how you get better as a professional and as a leader. 70% of that is what happens on the job. So if you don't have a manager who is making you better, by 1% every day, and also cultivating that sort of respect and trust, that is not going to enable you to maximize your potential. Next slide, please. So my second tip to you all is managers matter. Really, when you're interviewing for a job, you should be interviewing the manager just as much and assessing, is this somebody who will enable me to stretch in a way and get better every day, and also engender that kind of trust that you need in order to leap. Next slide, please. The other thing that is interesting about, our managers are well liked, but don't necessarily make us better, is that that's kind of indicative of some relational, personal, sort of driven dynamics in our sector. And in many ways, especially in smaller communities, there's almost a way in which our organizations work that is indicative of a family business. And so next slide, please. And so just to be mindful of the fact that relationships really matter. They matter no matter what, but in our community, I would say even more so. And let's say you want to leave a job, it's not working, or you're interviewing, just never burn a bridge. Our community is, we work with organizational development consultants, and there's a technical term for what the way in which we work. It is tribal. And so just knowing that as you think about, assessing different opportunities in that way. Next slide, please. Ultimately, who's best in class? We've worked with hundreds of organizations and they've all taken our survey. Is it that only foundations or only JCCs or only, New York-based organizations are best in class? No. The top 25 organizations in terms of type and size and gender of CEO and budget and organization size literally mirror the bottom 25. And so it really is all about the leader. Next slide, please. So my tip number 4 for you is leaders matter. So make sure you have confidence in the leader of the organization in which you choose to work, because that will get you to drive faster and also really enable you to be on a path that's purpose-filled and be engaged. Next slide, please. The last tip I have is just a sort of a panning out into the changing nature of I would say careers and just the way in which you could look at your career. And around 2009, Deloitte, a consulting firm, came out and basically said, you know what, the career ladder is dead. It's now the career lattice. So the days of our working at one organization, climbing the ladder, and then retiring 35 years later, or whatever else, from that organization as like a VP or the C or whatever, they're kind of dead. So the way in which we can look at our own careers, next slide, please, is that your professional trajectory will most likely not be linear. So being very open to that. So the way that that's manifested is by folks who say, should I take that program director role? But I'm program director now, it's a smaller organization. I would say lateral moves are totally fine. Going back is totally fine, as long as some of the ways in which you're assessing the organization and the role are aligned with what you're looking for. And know that there isn't going to be just this like up and to the right type of trajectory. The world is sort of a jungle gym, and so being able to sort of swing from vine to vine, it may not always look pretty. And that is the way in which really professional trajectories are mapping out that way now. I just want to end, next and last slide, just with a few resources. JPRO has some wonderful resources. There is a centralized job board called Career Hub that aggregates lots of opportunities of all different types within and across the Jewish community. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. And there are also some job seeking resources there too that can help with resume preparedness, interview preparedness, some due diligence that you can do as an applicant as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to, yep, my contact info. Please do reach out. I'm going to hand it off to Sarah or back to Matan.
Well, thank you so much, Gully. That was really amazing. And now that you have a sense, our audience, of what it might mean and what the industry looks like, Sarah is now going to come and sort of give you some technical tips and guidance about how do you really go and get that job. So, Sarah, take it away.
Hi, I just want to thank all of you for taking the time to come and join us. And also, I want to thank Respectability for allowing me to be here. I'm at a little bit of an intersection. I am the incoming Vice President of Workforce Development Services for NJHSA, and I am actually leaving a Jewish nonprofit organization in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I have been working in the Jewish industry for a long time, and I can talk to the value of the industry for sure. So today I'm just gonna, this is more of a micro level, a personal level, talking about, kind of the steps of finding a job or making a career transition. And this is more just to offer some of the pieces. And then there is more of a deeper dive that would need to you need to go into as an individual for this, but this will give some steps. So next slide, please. So the first thing is you want to focus your job search. And a lot of people, they get overwhelmed when they leave a job. So they decide they're going to make a career transition, or they become displaced, laid off. And they don't take enough time to think about what they're actually really wanting from a job. So really doing that self-inventory is important. Especially if you're somebody who has a disability, thinking about what you need from an organization to make your job satisfying and to make sure that you are successful in your job. So doing that self-inventory is very important. So you can use job search engines to find jobs and use keywords that match your interest, but be careful because some of these job search engines are really looking for personal information. So never disclose your social security number, that kind of information on a job search engine. And then really focus on developing a list of companies that you are interested in working for and research them. So then is what you might find is you really like the mission of an organization. You really like the work that they're doing. And they might have several different jobs posted. So you might create several different resumes and cover letters for a variety of jobs at one organization. You don't just have to apply for one job at a single organization. So you can also direct your job search based on company. Next slide, please. So building your brand. So your brand is a variety of things. The most concrete pieces of your brand are going to be your resume and your cover letter. So make sure that those are built to really showcase the skills that you bring. Oftentimes we see people using language in their resume and their cover letter that's not concrete. If you are able to show quantitative information, that is always good. If you were able to show metrics, numbers of how you were able to be successful in your career in the past, that's really going to bode well with moving through the human resources process, because they are looking for those numbers. They are looking for those metrics. They're also looking for the information. So if your resume is covered in graphics, or your resume is organized in a way that makes it challenging for them to find the information that they need, then they're probably going to pass it by. So make sure that your resume is clear and concise and gives the information that is relevant to the job that you are applying for. Your cover letter should offer some insight into the person that you are and why you would be good for that position. Cover letters, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but you want to make sure that that it's job specific. So you don't want a company to feel like you are blanket applying for hundreds of jobs with the same resume and cover letter. And so you just want to make sure that you're highlighting different important pieces based on the job description. Create a professional profile on LinkedIn. We are seeing more and more that LinkedIn is becoming very important in the job search process. It's also where organizations are going to even scout for new employees. So, think about what kind of keywords are going to show up, or what kind of keywords somebody could put in that would then have you fall into that search. So just make sure that your LinkedIn is professional. A strong personal brand will provide recruiters, employers, and contacts with a positive impression and will allow them to see you as a potential candidate for their organization. Next slide, please. Network. So a lot of people are like, oh, I don't like to network. I don't want to talk about my job loss. I don't want to talk about my career transition. And this is the most uncomfortable piece for people who are conducting a job search or looking to do a job transition. This is also one of the most important pieces. I hear people where they're like, I'm only going to talk to executive level people that could help me I'm a marketing person. I'm only going to talk to people in the marketing field. But that is really not the most beneficial way to do networking. You should be talking to everyone about your job search. You should be letting them know what you're interested in, what you're kind of looking for, because the main thing to think about is that just because somebody's not in marketing doesn't mean that their neighbor's not, that their neighbor hasn't talked to them about how they have a really hard position to fill and they have been struggling to find somebody for that position. It's also important because it really allows you to get comfortable talking about your job search process, or developing your what we call the elevator pitch, that kind of 90-second piece where you're kind of having to say, listen, this is who I am, this is what I am good at doing, and this is why I would be a good fit for your organization. So really starting to network and talk about yourself is an important piece. I will say we've kind of, at the organization I've just left, we really saw that this as an important piece that people were just shying away from. And so we started building out networking accountability groups, and people started finding jobs much quicker when they started talking to people about their job search. And I'm talking, we had one woman come in and tell us, you told me I had to talk to people. So when I was getting my car washed, I talked to the lady at the car wash, and her brother worked in the industry that I'm trying to get into. And now I have a lunch date set up to talk about, some informational interviewing. And so it's just important to really stretch and flex those muscles, those networking muscles. Next slide, please. So targeting your resume and cover letter. This is something we kind of touched on a few minutes ago, but just making sure that you are speaking specifically to a specific employer about a specific position. It's not uncommon for people to come in when they're in a job search and say, I've applied for 200 jobs and I haven't gotten an interview. And then you go back and you look at, you clicked the submit button to 200 different jobs, but you didn't actually look at the job description, or make sure that that job was a good match for you, or make sure that that organization was a good match for you. And also, you tend to see where people, when they kind of push those through really quickly, they might accidentally forget to change the name of the organization that they're applying for, or maybe their resume is a little bit disorganized and highlights some experiences that aren't really relevant to the job that they're actively applying for. So really taking the time to target your resume and cover letter is important. And I think this is also something to remember is, while a lot of Jewish communal services or Jewish service organizations don't have HR departments because they're really small, many do because they're very large. And so regardless of if you're trying to get into the Jewish nonprofit sector, you're trying to get into any nonprofit sector or any industry really across the board, is a lot of times you're going to have to get through those HR gatekeepers. So making it very simple that they can recognize your value, because you want to get your resume pushed down to that hiring manager. So make sure that you're targeting. Next slide, please. Prepare for the interview. Taking the time, this is another thing where people are just uncomfortable kind of working through this process, like networking, really talking to people networking, interviewing are where people become very, very stressed out. So taking the time to prepare for the interview, the more you prepare, the less stressful it's going to be. You know, it's okay to sit down. You know, there's probably going to be a handful of questions that they're going to ask you. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about your greatest strengths. Tell me about some of your weaknesses. Talk to me about a challenge. Having those stories already lined up in your back pocket is going to remove some of that stress. Now, yes, you might get a hiring manager or an HR manager who asks you some questions that are a little bit off the wall that you do have to think about. But if you know that you already have those core questions lined up, that's going to reduce a lot of stress. Make sure that you research the company, make sure you have that job description floating through your brain so that you can use those keywords in the interview. Always dress appropriately. And we're seeing as people, you know, just remember that there are lots of ways to impress people, and dressing appropriately is just one of them. And unfortunately, the first couple seconds, people get judged. So make sure that your attire is appropriate. And I would say, you know, the more you can talk to people and kind of run your interviewing past others, the more that you're going to be comfortable when you walk in that room. So really doing that uncomfortable work on the beginning, running through those questions, having someone say, no, that sounds weird when you say that, or no, you need to highlight this more. Having all of that done before is really going to make the interview a lot easier. Next slide, please. Connect with people and resources that can help. So, you know, Gali put in some resources a few moments ago through JPro, and there are a lot of other resources available. You want to look in your community. There's probably Jewish human service agencies that are doing this type of work, that are doing workforce development support. And most of the time that is free or low cost. So look and see what's going on in your area that is providing free supports. You can also look at your former college or training institute, or if you're in another community, a lot of those universities have reciprocity agreements. So even if you went to a university in another state, their career services office will still meet with you and talk to you about your career search in their area. You can also look at the local One Stop, which would be kind of the WIOA funded, government-backed place where people often get their unemployment supports, but they also do have support for job seekers who are not necessarily collecting unemployment compensation. You know, here in the coming weeks, you're going to be hearing about a new initiative from NJHSA called the U.S. National Jobs Initiative. And this is where we're really going to try to start pushing these supports more broadly into communities that don't have them already built into the infrastructure. So, you know, as you kind of begin your job search process, just keep that in the back of your mind that if you don't have those supports in your community, that there are going to be ways to connect you with those supports in a meaningful way. Next slide, please. So this is my information. I don't technically start until August 2nd, but I am already getting emails. So, you know, please be patient with me as I kind of onboard and move through the process, but I am excited to meet with people and talk about workforce development. And I think that's all that I have. So I think we're just going to open it up for questions.
Thank you. And let me reiterate, first of all, thank you to the panelists. That was fantastic. But now I'm speaking to the audience. And what I'm saying to you all is this is a webinar for you. This is an opportunity for you to get answered the questions that you have. So we have some questions that have come in, and that's great. But this is the moment. If you have a question, put it in that Q&A box. Put it in the Facebook Live comment chat. We have roughly 25 minutes where our panelists can answer your questions. So think about what they've said, the experiences they've shared, and take a moment to put it in that Q&A box. But for the time being, let's jump to our first question that we do have. This is a question that I'm going to direct at both of you, actually, which is that you have spoken mostly about the Jewish sector because that's honestly the purpose of this webinar, and yet we recognize there are probably people watching the webinar who may seek opportunities outside of the Jewish sector. And so is there any little coda that you would put on any of the remarks that you made that of how they relate to going outside of the Jewish sector, whether it's data differences or just brief minutes that folks might want to do? And Gali, do you want to speak to that first and then Sarah?
Sure, happy to. I mean, I would say if we're talking about the general nonprofit sector, the one that encompasses 1.5 million organizations across our nation, then I would say there's less of a tribal sense. Even though relationships matter, there's a less of a likelihood of having the types of situations that breed a lot of uncomfortability when you work in a more enclosed type of community. So I would say that is one change. The other is the potential freedom of movement across the lattice, if you will. So if you open up, in many ways, we are a microcosm of the nonprofit sector with similar themes and then like dissimilar themes. So one is, and we talked about this a little bit in our prep, it has to do with gender and how that is either the same in terms of comparability to general nonprofit sector as it is in the Jewish nonprofit sector. And it's not that easy. There isn't necessarily a blanket way of saying the general nonprofit sector also is more female identified and the leadership is more male identified. It's a lot more complicated than that. But I would say overall, once you get into the general nonprofit space, the world does open up to some extent in that you may have not one Jewish social service agency in your community, but maybe more like half a dozen social service agencies that could potentially be options for you. And then also thinking about some of those, organizational moves that you might make as you chart your own career trajectory.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah, just to kind of reiterate what Gali is saying, the Jewish human services sector doesn't work in a vacuum. It doesn't work in a silo. So even if you are working for a Jewish human services organization, you're going to be collaborating and partnering with organizations that are not religiously affiliated at all. And so I think that just making sure that your resume and your experience speaks broadly will help you to either continue to develop a career in Jewish human services or expand beyond. And remember, people move across industries too. So you can go from nonprofit sector to for-profit sector, then back to nonprofit sector. The thing to remember is that all the experiences that you gather, all of them, even when you are raising children at home or taking care of an aging parent, all of these are experiences that add to the value that you bring to an employer. So we just really you might need some help showcasing that, but don't put yourself in a one bucket and say, I can only fit into this bucket, because you can't. You can fit into a lot of places. We just need to find the right fit for you.
Thank you to both of you. I am going to now combine two questions into a hybrid question. So one question was asking if you've been in the Jewish nonprofit space for, say, 10 plus years, is that good, or should you be looking for a different type of job experience? Combined with that is, if you do believe that you're going to make a change in the next few years, assuming that you decide that, what might be the best way to go about that? So I think those can be answered in a combined sort of fashion. And who, Sarah, do you want to go first this time, since I invited Gali to go first on the last one?
Sure. So I think if you are starting to have those feelings of, maybe I'm wanting to try something new, maybe I should try to have a different experience, don't wait until you're unhappy in your job to start looking for another job. Start looking now. This doesn't have to be an intensive engaging process at the beginning, just doing some slow exploration, starting to talk to people, see what other opportunities are out there. Oftentimes, we also see that people start to do this work and go, wait, I actually really am well suited for the job that I'm in. I might just need to add an additional challenge or shake things up a little bit. So doing that explorative work, don't wait until you are unhappy in your job to start that process. Start it now. I think I answered it all. I need to add anything else, Matan?
Well, I want to see what Gali might have to add to the.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And look, if you're getting a 10+ year itch, so there are a couple of things to consider there. One is, what is the role of your manager therein? Like, we know that a good manager, you're going to have conversations. They're hopefully going to ask you, Matan, where do you see yourself in 3 years, 5 years? How can I help you get there? So is there an opportunity for you to potentially shift roles, take on something new, stretch? That's possibility. And maybe it's not, maybe, you know, you've exhausted those options. If that's the case, look, the nonprofit sector has a lot of different options. The Jewish nonprofit sector also has a lot of options. So there is a way in which we know that there's pretty easy mobility, and definitely it's easier to move within a context. So easier to move from, like, let's say, a federation to a JCC to a Jewish camp, etc. The one thing is, if you do want to, you know, go outside of the Jewish world, just thinking about how you translate what you've done into more general terms. In the same way that if you wanted to, let's say, try your hand in the private sector, and let's say you're a fundraiser, you wouldn't necessarily talk about fundraising, you talk about sales. So just thinking about that, and my sense is that there are different coaches and different resources to be able to help you look through your resume, tell your story, and therefore try to use the lexicon of the place that you're looking for. And I would agree with Sarah, like, any meaningful job that you're going to get into is going to take a minimum probably of 3 months to find. The more senior, probably 6 to 9, depending on, you know, constraints and different priorities for you. So definitely don't wait until you actively hate your job. That's just a state that no one deserves to be in.
Thank you to both of you. So I'm going to take a minute and just, because there is a question in the chat about should one look at company reviews, and I'm just going to say that I believe Sarah covered that in her presentation, that it actually is a good idea to research the organization before you go. So I just wanted to highlight that and then move on to another question here. And the question is directed at Gali, but I think both of you could answer it. And it is, in looking at the question of career lattice, there's no longer a ladder, there's now a lattice. How does one think about advancement? How do you actually move up in the ranks of your career when there's no longer precisely a ladder to climb? And again, we'll let Gali speak to that first, and then Sarah, if you have anything to add, please do.
Sure. Well, it really depends on the priorities that you need in the moment. So for some, it might mean, I want to make more money. That actually might come from you moving from a smaller organization to a larger organization, let's say, but in a lateral move. That might not necessarily exhibit a title change that would signal to the world, this person is moving up. So, but it really depends on priority, because everything's a trade-off. So if moving up is you getting more responsibility, you learning new skills, you making more money, you having more agency potentially in your life, those are some decisions that, you know, a person has to make, and they're very personal, and they're not static. I mean, there are other variables that happen in our life. Work is one component. That's where, you know, different priorities shift. I will say that the biggest litmus test for us, and what we advise if we're in a position to advise, is, are you going to be able to learn something new? I mean, that's really it. Whether it's a skill, whether it's, you know what, I always liked Matan, I really want to see him in action. Like, I want to be managed by him. Like, let's go follow him into battle. That's great. Even if it's you move from like a program associate to a program associate role, or associate role, you know, I think it's more around that. Because remember, why is the career ladder dead? Because you all can open Google, learn a new language, a computer language, a skill, whatever that enables you to have a completely new opportunity open up to you in ways that were never possible with previous generations, probably not more than like a decade ago. So that's sort of how I would look at, what are your priorities, and know that the priorities can be, it's not always as, straight up as, oh, well, I have to make more money and the title has to be, senior director, not just director. Not necessarily. There are a lot of factors at play there.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. Do you have anything to add
I mean,
on that question?
just really echo what Golly's saying, that, we're at there's a lot of different points in people's lives where a career change has an impact. So, going from, if you end up in a situation, we're seeing so many people now kind of stuck in the sandwich generation between raising children and taking care of parents. And we have so many more women in the workforce than we had in the workforce 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So, trying to figure out what you need and really kind of looking specifically at the experience. If you need to go to part-time for a little while and make a little bit less money, but you can get some really good experience that pushes you towards your goals. If you've been a little bitty fish in a really huge pond in LA or New York for a while, and now you can go to a smaller community and be a big fish in a tiny pond, that might bring a different experience. So, just be really willing to kind of try different avenues and kind of also just see where things take you as you start to talk to people and what opportunities present themselves. I will say it is a lot of jobs are found before they hit the internet. So if you wait for a job to hit a job board, you just increased your competition infinitely. So if you can start doing that, talking to people, say, hey, in 6 months, we think we're going to post this position. Is this something that you think you'd be interested in? That kind of conversation will really help with kind of navigating a search long term.
Well, thank you both of you for that. I'm going to combine two questions that are here that also sort of jump off of something you just said, Sarah, about how one could even say jump to a part-time role if it gave valuable experience to grow forward. So the two questions are really about what types of experience should potentially go into a job application, resume, or a LinkedIn. And the person has specifically referred to, in one case, whether one should add community college, even if one has a higher level of education also available, and also should one put on part-time roles, and should you put on especially part-time roles that are not directly related to the job to which you are applying. So this time it's, I think, Sarah first and then Golly. So Sarah, thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think the main thing, a resume should not be more than 2 pages long. And if you are newly coming into a career, your resume should be a page long. You want to remove what would be deemed irrelevant information. Now, all of your information is relevant at some level, but with getting through the kind of initial 5-minute preview that they're going to see, you want to put what is most relevant to the job description. So, going to community college, incredibly important experience. You probably got some amazing skills. Having it on there is probably valuable. If you got an associate's degree or something, putting it on there, but it shouldn't take up more than a line. If you attended community college, but it was maybe you took 2 classes there and you didn't get any certifications, then it doesn't need to go on your resume. It's the same thing with part-time work experience. You might have worked at, your parents' store for many, many years. And while that was a really good experience, it doesn't directly relate to the position that you're applying to, but you did a 6-month free internship that does directly relate to it. So you'd want to put more information and heavyweight that internship versus that long-term work experience. I think most people in America today have kind of those starter jobs, whether they be in hospitality or food service. And while those jobs are really important to building the character, if they don't directly relate to what you're applying for, then you probably don't need to put, work to cash register for this amount of time, unless you're going into the baking industry, then that would be relevant, so you kind of need to look specifically at the job description and build it from there. And like Gali has mentioned too, there are people that will help you figure this out. You don't have to do this on your own.
Yeah,
I think that's excellent advice, Gali.
Yeah, build up on that. I agree with Sarah. I think this is also where you can tell your story. Like the resume, if we're really being honest, a manager is going to be looking at that for maybe 35 seconds. Scan the thing, and so that's why it's almost like the most important thing is like your name. And then like at the bottom, there's usually like special skills. And so, like it's like karate, Matan, I didn't know that you like karate, but that's the kind of thing that like that makes Matan stick out. Or languages or hobbies or stuff like that, which are, like take up literally 10-point font, but are important. I think the resume is one level. When you tell your story, I mean, I think building on what Sarah said, you do want to show a certain level of consistency and like that like build the story of I am someone who is here and able to deliver on results, whether that be a cashier working my first job out of high school, which you can learn incredible soft skills there that are very important. And so you want to talk about that and not just necessarily say, yeah, I did that. Same thing with a lot of first time jobs, or let's say at a camp. Camp counselors learn a lot there. And so unpacking some of those skills, I think beyond the resume, being able to showcase some of the skills that you've built. There's a reason why LinkedIn has literally put on as a category caretaking. Like if you've been a parent, because this isn't just like something that's like, a throwaway. This is something that is literally building our society. So thinking in some way, more expansively about how you want to tell your story, even if some of the professional experiences aren't directly perfect bullseye into the position that you want to go for, that can also make you stand out and help you make sense of all that you've been learning as you've been in the professional workforce.
So I actually have a quick follow-up question to you both based on that. And let's, since this is one of my questions, let's keep it as a quick answer because I'm not as important as the audience in this regard. But how do resume gaps filter into that, or leaving off an experience that might then create a resume gap because you weren't sure whether to put it on?
You want your dates to line up. So whether it takes up one line because it doesn't need bullet points explanation, you just want it there to show that you had food service experience, but you were employed at the time, or it does have bullet points because it does directly relate. The thing with gaps is gaps are not as much of a problem as consistent gaps. So, if you are somebody who had a gap, there is a reason in people's lives why they have gaps, or there's a reason in people's lives why they had short-term experiences. But talking to those short-term experiences is important. It's when you start to see that somebody has not stayed anywhere for more than a year consistently on their resume, or has lots of gaps, then that's going to need further explanation. One often, and I'll just throw this out there as an example, is one type of resume that we see a lot of people struggle with is people who work on grants. So their grants end every 2 years and then they flip to a new grant. And so their resume can look very broken up, like, oh, I haven't held a job for more than 9 months or 14 months or whatever, and it's based on a grant. Make sure that that's in there. These are the funded grants that I have worked on. It's not different jobs, it's different projects.
Thanks so much. Gali, is there anything to add on that? Or I think Sarah really covered it very well. We are beginning to run short on time. So what I want to say is, first I want to acknowledge there's a question here in the Q&A from Benji Hirschhorn, but I'm going to say, Benji, that I think that question will be better presented to the panel on Thursday. The panel on Thursday is actually professionals with disabilities who have been navigating these worlds. So I'm going to recommend, Benji, that if you come back to our Thursday webinar, put that question back in the Q&A, and we will very cheerfully answer it there. And in terms of what I think will be our last question that we can pose to this panel, I just want to ask, with everything that you have said, a quick thought on what, if anything, has changed because of COVID and the virtual world. Networking no longer looks as it does. Interviewing no longer looks as it once did. Thoughts on the changes brought by COVID? And I think you'll have them because this is a question that y'all gave me that you wanted me to pose. So I look forward to hearing what you have to offer.
Sarah, you want to?
Okay, I'll go first. I think that we are still, even though we are coming out of COVID, we are still in the midst of COVID. So being flexible with employers, some employers are coming back and doing face-to-face interviews. Some are still working through virtual interviews, and some are still remaining focused on phone screening. So, just being able to kind of go with the flow for that, and being able to advocate for yourself and showcase yourself in all of those different medias. Also, once again, the networking piece, not shying away from it. In some ways, it's even more uncomfortable now for some people because it's in a virtual and you are maybe missing some of those social cues. You can't tell if somebody's leaning into the conversation or if they're interested. And in some ways, it might be easier for some people who get really, really nervous in those face-to-face settings. So just being allowing yourself to kind of sit in that discomfort of those interviewing processes and those networking processes, and just continuing to come to the table. You're going to have bad interviews. You're going to have bad phone screenings. You're going to have bad social networking events. But the more you come to the table, the easier it's going to be. And just to reiterate, there are places in your community that will do this with you. And if for some reason you can't find those places, there are friends, neighbors who will help you with kind of building out your resume, building out your cover letter, and being more engaged in the networking world. So just that you're not alone to do this.
Thank you, Sarah. And Golly, if you have maybe 1 minute you want to add on that, we could do that.
Yeah.
So.
I think it's a really exciting time for anyone looking for a job. The recovery is really interesting. It seems like we are in a recovery. There's certainly a lot of employment opportunities. They call it the great reshuffle. People are looking at their lives saying, what do I really want to do? Because the last year and a half have put some perspective. And I think it's a very, very exciting time, in the same way that, employee and job seekers need to be flexible. I think that organizations are much more flexible when it comes to the type of work arrangements and, hybrid offices and more remote opportunities, and therefore potentially more accessible opportunities for different employees. And that means possibly even geographic stretching, and all of a sudden those roles that you thought weren't open to you in New York become open to you, even though you live in the Berkshires or what have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. I really want to thank the panelists, and I want to end with a little bit of a plug, and then we're going to move to our closing material. The plug is to say there are some technical questions that have been posed in the Q&A box. We do not have time to answer those live, but since a lot of those could be answered by your local Jewish vocational service or others, I'm sure Sarah would not mind. She had put her email up before, and she can connect you with the local organization, and that will be able to provide you with that more direct support with some of those very technical questions. Sarah, I hope you don't mind that I just volunteered you.
Google also works well because I won't be in the office until August 2nd.
There you go. Google your local Jewish vocational service, and they can probably help out. Having myself served on the board of multiple, I know they are great organizations. But so we are now moving to our closing material. So I could ask Josh to put up the closing slides for me. I first want to do a very quick plug, very quick, because we're really running low on time, for our National Disability Speakers Bureau. If you are doing a program and you think you want some lived disability experience, please email jakes@respectability.org. You can find out more at the link in the chat. Next slide, please. And I want to tell you about the Respectability Jewish Inclusion Fellowship. So let's say you're at the beginning of that lattice that everyone was speaking about, but you know that you want to be a nonprofit leader and you are a person with a disability. Our Jewish Inclusion Fellowship and our National Leadership Program more broadly is a great way to start if you are at the very least in your senior year of college, but perfectly good if it's quite far beyond. Please go to http://aboutus/fellowship for the general fellowship. And if you add in Jewish Inclusion Fellowship, you'll get to Jewish Inclusion. Next slide. And so I want to end at 11:30 on the dot, saying thank you again to the panelists and see you on Thursday for effective disability advocacy from the inside. Thank you, everyone.